Hi, everyone. Welcome to Financial Inclusion Week 2023. We're excited to be a part of this and then share this video with you. My name is Sophie Javers. I'm the Global Engagement Manager at the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Markets, Risk, and Resilience. And we are going to be starting off with this video on making insurance fully available for women with the help of digital goats. I would like to move along here with a little bit of background. So this is a collaborative research project that was funded by USAID's Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Markets, Risk, and Resilience. And it is a project that has been evaluating the effectiveness of graduation programming, as well as investigating how to protect development gains and prevent backsliding via gender-focused insurance products. The goal of this project through financial inclusion is to create a sustainable pathway towards resilience for vulnerable women. And we've had some really great partners as part of this project, our Innovation Lab, along with the International Livestock Research Institute, Takaful Insurance Africa, and the BOMA project. So a little bit continuing with the background. So the BOMA Poverty's Graduation Model, Rural Entrepreneur Access Project, or REAP, was launched in Northern Kenya in 2013, and is a sequence of gender-focused interventions over 2 years that includes participant training, conditional cash transfers, financial and life skills trainings, hands-on mentoring and coaching, and the establishment of savings and access to credit. The focus is both on building tangible material assets and intangible psychological assets. And with the evaluation that the MR Innovation Lab conducted, we saw a 320% increase in women's productive assets, 32% increase in family cash income, a 510% increase in women's savings. The long-term effect of the BOMA program, based on this initial evaluation, is that there's an increase in women's assets by about $400. So this is incredibly impressive results, but there are caveats. What happens when a shock, and drought is one of the most prevalent in this area, occurs that could potentially wipe out all of these development gains? So using this data that from the evaluation, the results show that one standard deviation increase in the severity of the shock, usually drought, measured in community level livestock mortality, results in a $134 reduction in women's business assets. And this is purchasing power parity dollars. So that's a huge hit to the built up assets that these women have been working hard to make. So the question is, can the combination of two different types of interventions come together to fundamentally alter the poverty dynamics for women in a cost-effective way? So the graduation programs, as we just seen, build up the assets of these women, but can new insurance markets and products really protect those assets? So that's the question that we're going to get into next. And what I would do is like to introduce our next speaker, the Professor of Economics at University of San Francisco, Andrew Hobbs. And Andrew, I would like to invite you to continue this video for us. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sophie. So let me get to the right slide. So I'm going to be bringing in the digital goats aspect that Sophie mentioned earlier. As Sophie mentioned, the question that we're interested in answering is how can we build an insurance product that includes women and it fits their needs as well as those of men. In this context, the Northern Kenya context, as well as many others, men are in charge of the primary source of income, which in Northern Kenya is livestock, and in other places might be the primary crop. And it makes sense to insure the biggest risks that affect the household. And so it did make sense historically to focus on livestock for insurance. But we wanted to design an insurance product that would be appealing and useful for women as well. And so what we decided to do was test out a product that would be focused on ensuring household expenses rather than assets or income. We wanted to test this product in a quick way. We wanted to be able to see how people would react to this new idea without having to wait for several seasons of insurance. And we wanted a way to be able to prove to the insurance company and others involved that this might be an interesting idea. And that's where the digital goats came in. So we decided to design a tablet-based video game that would simulate insurance purchases in a sort of realistic context that fit the environment where these people are actually making decisions. In order to do that, I put together a working group built from the enumerators that had been recruited for the project that Sophie was telling you about earlier. The enumerators all grew up in this region, and so they understand the dynamics, and they were able to help us build a game that realistically captures the key elements of day-to-day life in sort of a livestock rearing household. This was a months-long collaboration. Part of it was done in Samburu County, Kenya, with the help of the enumerators. And then we were communicating back and forth virtually, with me sending them versions of the app, them giving me feedback, and then me making tweaks over the months. And that's a picture there on the slide of the enumerators testing the application and writing down their notes. So I'm going to show you a short demo here of the app itself. So this is the SimPastoralist screen. As you can see, participants can buy goats. So right now you can see the little goats appearing on the screen. You start with an initial budget, and you can allocate it between goats and insurance. So now those little shields up there represent units of insurance. And you can make a decision whether or not to send your children to school. Just have sort of a realistic household expense in there. Once you're done, you can click the name up there in the corner. The game verifies that it's your final decision, and then we wait for the weather to reveal itself. So you can see the clouds moving across the sky, and it rained, which means it was a good year. As the game then says, it was a good year. That means the goats produced milk, more goats were born, and there was no insurance payout. So this also helps people understand how insurance works. Now, when the next round starts, they need to pay household expenses. So we set that as a fixed 5,000 Kenyan shillings. And as you can see, the goats did reproduce, so there are more goats than before. Again, this player is choosing to buy more insurance. The game requires you to make that school decision, so we need to make that decision. This player decided to sell some goats in order to pay for school, which again is a realistic kind of outcome. And as you can see, now the weather's going. So far, no rain, a little bit stressful, and it was a drought. Because it was a drought, goats were lost, but this player had insured 10 goats, so they're getting a 10,000 shilling insurance payout. And once they press the OK button, the goats who were lost will fall off the screen, representing the fact that they died. So that repeats itself a number of times, 10 times per session of the game. And players are able to make the decisions repeatedly multiple times before we ran the actual experiment. Once they were introduced to the game and they understood how it worked, we told them, okay, now we're going to play the game for real. In some of the settings, we explained the insurance as livestock insurance, and that was in keeping with the traditional livestock insurance that had been in place in the region for recent months and had been in the broader region for several years. In the other half of the sessions, we added some additional features to the insurance explanation. We said you can use this insurance to insure your livestock and pay to replace them or to feed them during a drought, but you can also use this insurance to pay for your household expenses during a drought. So this can make it so that you don't need to sell a goat to send your kids to school, so that you can pay for medical expenses, so that you can make sure everyone has enough food in the event of a drought. So again, the insurance itself works in the same way, but we're explaining it in a new way and representing it as what we now call family insurance, which is designed to support household expenses during a drought. What we found as a result of this experiment, and you can see here, this picture is actually during the actual study. The person in the middle is the enumerator, and the two people on the sides are the couple that's playing the game. What we found was that this family framing, where we included the idea of paying for household expenses as a benefit, increased the total spending allocated to insurance purchased by women who are playing the game by about 20%. And for men, it didn't seem to have much effect, which means it doesn't seem to reduce the interest of men, but it significantly increased the interest of women in the insurance product, which is what we expected. I'm now going to turn this presentation over to Michael Carter, who's a professor of agriculture and resource economics at UC Davis and the director of the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Markets, Risk, and Resilience. And he'll tell you more about what we did next.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. So the next step after what Andrew just shared with us, the next step for us was to, oh dear, let me get this. The next step was to say, will this work in the real world? So we took the kind of results that Andrew just shared with them. We talked to our partners, in particular, Takaful Insurance Africa, and we say, we think we found something here that will increase the commercial interest in your product. Would you be willing to try it out with us? And so thankfully they were. In fact, they've been a tremendous supporter of this activity, and a big hats off to the CEO, Sumaya Hassan, for the support she's given to this somewhat pioneering effort. So when we took it to the field, we basically said there were two things in that game that Andrew just explained to us that were really important. The first thing was making clear that women themselves are indirectly exposed to rangeland risk. As Andrew said, culturally in that area, men are the one that are in charge of herding livestock out on the open rangeland, and it's the health of that open rangeland that can actually be insured using remote sensing techniques. And that's how the existing index-based livestock insurance works. As part of the prelude to the game work that Andrew described, we talked to just a few women, and it took them about 5 seconds to recognize that they themselves were indirectly exposed to that rangeland risk. That is, they very well know that even that when things are difficult out on the rangelands for their husbands, that comes back and lands on their heads, because the husbands are no longer sending back resources to help with family expenses. They simply say to the women, you figure out how to keep the kids in school. You figure out how to feed the family members, and it becomes the woman's problem. And there's actually quite a large body of research that shows that women's assets are typically those most exposed to risk when things happen to the primary economic activity of the family. So this kind of, you might call it intra-household risk shifting, is something that we can, as academics, we can put fancy labels on it, but it's something that almost every woman understands. So what Andrew did in his game was then to, number one, to make this indirect exposure of women to risk clear. When we took it out to the real world, we created a set of comic books. The one I'm showing here, panels taken from that comic book in the English language version, which shows two women talking about how things are going. And on the far left, you can see one woman explaining things are difficult out in the rangelands. There's nothing for her husband's animals to eat, but that comes back and bounces back on her head, right? And now suddenly she's trying to make a decision. Can she still send her daughter to school or not? How is she going to feed the family? So the first step here in forming what we now call gender inclusive insurance was to really articulate the connection between rangeland risk, which we can insure with remote sensing techniques, to women's immediate expenditure responsibility. The second step, and again, it was captured in the games that Andrew explained to us, is to sell the units in units, to sell the insurance rather in units that make sense for women's expenditure responsibility. So a woman's worried, I've got 3 kids, one of whom is in school. I know I'm indirectly exposed to this rangeland risk, but how much money do I actually need? And this insurance was typically sold in units of tropical livestock units, so number of cows you want to insure. And that's something that makes a lot of sense to men, because they're out there on the rangeland and they're worried, how many of those animals do they need to protect? The woman's worried about the same risk ultimately, but she's worried about how many people does she need to protect. So we did some calculations actually using numbers that come from Kenya's emergency cash transfer program. And we basically converted animal units into family units. And so we were able to say to women, you're exposed to this rangeland risk. Think about how many family members you need to protect in terms of their consumption needs or schooling needs, and buy that number of units. So it were these two things together that allowed us to take an insurance contract, which is really fundamentally, or in the first instance, calibrated to men's interest, but translated into something that would be salient to women and would make it easy for them to calculate what their insurance needs might be. So we took that step in the study area where we were studying the graduation program that Sophie told us about a moment ago in Samburu County in northern Kenya. We then introduced randomly in half of our study areas this novel inclusive form of insurance for women, and in the other half of the study areas, we continued to do the standard sort of marketing procedure with the insurance sold only in livestock units. We tried to keep everything else similar between the units, so we made a comic book for both areas. We actually had audio files in the Samburu language, reading out the comic book, and did a number of things to help market the insurance. So the question is, does it really work? It worked in Andrew's game with digital goats. Would real people actually respond to this sort of thing? So I'm not going to go into detail on these bar graphs, but they just display the econometric estimates that come from the data that were collected here. And what we see, what really comes out of this, is that at the end of the study, when subsidies came to an end, in those communities where we had used the family framing, it basically increased the insurance demand by about 20 to 30%. So really numbers that are actually were fairly close to what Andrew saw in the game, not quite as large, but this is now people spending their own real money, not spending money in Andrew's game. So two things really jump out at us here that come out of this study is, number one, the family framing actually really is important and it makes the market larger. So as you can imagine, our partners at Takaful Insurance Africa found this incredibly exciting, because any insurance company trying to sell these kinds of products is worried about the volume of sales that they're able to obtain compared to their fixed cost of providing this insurance to the market. But the other thing that jumps out is, as part of the overall study, we had provided, in earlier years, we'd provided partial insurance subsidies randomly to some people. And what we discover is that the framing, any kind of framing, has no impact whatsoever on demand of people who did not have prior subsidies. And what the subsidies had allowed people to do in the earlier periods is to experiment with the insurance, understand how it worked, and begin to trust it. So in the end, we walk away, I think, with two really key messages here. The first, that making insurance speak to the needs of women is really important and incredibly valuable, and in fact is doable, even in an environment like northern Kenya, where there's such a strong gender division of labor and gender division of household responsibility. But secondly, for a totally novel product like a risk management technology such as insurance is, subsidies have a role to play in terms of allowing people to dabble and experiment. And when you put those two things together, you actually get some fairly remarkable results. So just to summarize that, what we see in the post-subsidy period under the standard framing, about 20% of households bought insurance, which may not sound like a lot, but that is actually an astronomically high number in the world of index insurance for an unsubsidized product being sold to individuals. And when the family framing was used, when insurance was made fully inclusive of women, that number doubled or increased by 50% to 30% of families buying it. And these are all statistically significant kinds of differences. So the final comment I'll make is, we sort of figured out a way to improve the sales of insurance, to make it speak to women, to make it clear that it's valuable to them. And the real question is, does it really work? So as Sophie already mentioned, This bar graph on the left shows the causal impact estimates of the BOMA asset building program on women's assets. And the top bar is when women are not exposed to shocks. The causal impact is over $300 US per woman. When a large shock comes along, basically that cuts that in half. Okay. And that's for women without insurance. So what we're seeing is exactly what we feared and that motivated this work, is that women's assets in this economy are exposed to rangeland risk. And when a rangeland shock occurred, lo and behold, half of the hard-earned benefits that BOMA worked with these women to create just disappears. Now, the bar on the right shows what happens when those same shocks happened and women actually had been offered insurance. And as you can see, it doesn't 100% mitigate the impact of the shock, but it largely allows women to protect the assets that they've built up. So we find this, I should stress, these are preliminary estimates right here, but we're quite confident that they're reliable, at least in sort of the general qualitative picture. So in the end, we think they're the large gains to reformulating insurance, exposing, making clear to people women's exposure to rangeland risk. We think subsidies have a role to play. We definitely see evidence that shocks can truly devastate women's assets that can be built up through a lot of hard work. And again, the exciting news is that combining asset building with asset protection really seems to open the door, not just to a temporary reduction in poverty, but actually to a long-term and a sustainable reduction in poverty. So with that, let me turn it back over to Sophie, and thank you all very much for your attention.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone.
Okay.
I hope you
Bye,
enjoyed
everybody.
our video. Bye.
Ciao. Bye.